Hey, hello, and welcome to the Think Twice podcast. I'm Jordan Yule.
And I'm Jacob Schreiner-Briggs.
How are you today, Jake?
I'm doing all right. A lot of talking today. We're hearing a lot of each other.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is this is our second. We got a third episode we're recording tonight. We're putting in a lot of time and effort into this podcast.
Yeah, putting in that work.
Yeah.
Pumping out content.
Yeah, we got to keep our listeners happy. They want the best. We're going to try to give them the best. So if you do want to subscribe, you could go to patreon.com/thinktwice. There you will be able to access our premium episodes, which we will start to be pumping out on a much more frequent basis. Our first one was the other night with Justin Hendricks of the NYU Media Lab, and we discussed the role of Facebook and social media and interest and personality and big data, using all those data sets, targeting you with Facebook posts and articles and gaming Google search results, how all of this is the new normal for media and how it's used in politics. It's an invigorating and enlightening discussion. I would highly recommend it. Some of our premium subscribers have said it is their favorite episode to date. I would definitely recommend it.
Remember, we're talking the cost of one beer, one inflatable raft. So if you can spare it.
Yeah, it's $5. $5 a month, next to nothing. It's one beer. Consider you'd be buying us a beer for putting in the time and effort to bring you the best content, and ultimately we would like to do this on a much more frequent, fuller basis, and with that, we would just want to do support without giving you those annoying ads. We don't want to do stamps.com ads or Blue Apron, so a direct listener to podcaster model was what we thought would be a better approach.
But in the meantime, we must press on, and with that, we will introduce the featured guest of this episode. So today we will be having a conversation with Samuel Sinyangwe. Samuel is a policy analyst and data scientist who works with communities of color to fight systemic racism through cutting-edge policies and strategies. Sam has supported movement activists across the country to collect and use data as a tool for fighting police violence, through mapping police violence, and to launch Campaign Zero, a comprehensive platform to end police violence. Previously, Sam worked at PolicyLink to support a national network of 61 promised neighborhoods, communities, to build cradle-to-career systems of support for low-income families. He also worked with city leaders, youth activists, and community organizations to develop comprehensive agendas to achieve quality education, health, and justice for young Black men. Sam grew up in Orlando, Florida, and has been involved in organizing and advocacy since he was in high school. He graduated from Stanford University in 2012, where he studied how race and racism impact the United States political system. Join us in welcoming to the podcast Samuel Sinyangwe. So we're with Sam Sinyangwe. Sam, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It's good to be here.
So before we start to get into the substance of the work that you're doing and your focuses with data analysis, police violence, and so on, Jordan and I were interested, just maybe taking a few minutes to get your thoughts on today's Senate Intelligence Committee hearing. We saw that you were tweeting about it pretty actively. So I don't know, do you have any initial thoughts or comments that you'd like to make for the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things stood out. One, I was, like, the big thing for me was seeing all of these Republican senators trying to make this about Hillary Clinton's emails, which was, like, I didn't think at this point, this far into, Trump's presidency, like, we're still talking about Hillary Clinton's emails, and then, like, John McCain I don't even know what he made no sense, but, like, he was trying to say, like, why did you close the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, but you didn't close this completely separate investigation into Trump? So that whole thing was kind of wild to me. And I think the other piece that was interesting was, Comey, essentially, like, didn't say it explicitly, but strongly hinted that he thought that Trump was trying to obstruct justice. And I think it's just another case of Trump and people in his administration, like, openly breaking the law and like not getting arrested, not getting held accountable because Republicans are, I guess, loyal to him.
It's incredible because Luck, her up was such a mainstay of crowd chants his entire campaign. So for a party and a base that was so hell bent on putting Hillary in prison, now is just casually looking away as we have the FBI, the former FBI director, testifying on the Hill about alleged criminality.
And the two Republican defenses of Trump that just blow me away are, first of all, that because he himself is not under investigation, then he's clear of any wrongdoing, as if you can't possibly instruct an investigation of which you are not the subject. That's one. Two is their reliance on the use of the word hope in these quotes in the Comey memo and in his written testimony, that Trump hoped that Comey would let Michael Flynn go. Kamala Harris made a point that when she was a prosecutor, if you were examining a case where someone had a gun to someone's head and they said, well, I hope that you'd give me your wallet, that a prosecutor isn't going to focus on the word hope as the operative word used in that phrase. And these are the defenses that are being articulated by Republican senators and members of Congress. And so I don't know. It's just, I don't know if I'm being biased, but it seems to me like it's a pretty weak case that's being made after this hearing in defense of the president.
Right. And then there was Paul Ryan today saying that like he thought that Trump just didn't know what he was doing, is new to this, I think the quote was. So like their defense is that like either Trump is just so incompetent and woefully unprepared to be president that he's just doing these things without knowing that they're bad, and so somehow that's an excuse, which is a really terrible thing when you think about it, or that he isn't being intentional about it, which makes it a criminal matter. So like there's really the Republicans don't have an excuse that doesn't look bad for Trump.
In an earlier conversation, Jake was pointing out how this was the criticism levied against then Senator Obama. His inexperience was just cause for not voting for him because he wouldn't do a great job. But now it's used as reasoning to justify Trump's actions, and it's just a total double standard.
Right. I mean, the reality is that like Obama would have been impeached by now if he did like any of the things that Trump has done. But Trump is held to another standard, and not only Trump, but Jeff Sessions committing perjury. You have Michael Flynn, essentially taking money from foreign governments, potentially committing treason. I mean, all of these things, Obama and anybody in his administration would not be able to get away with.
Absolutely. So you are here because you are a rock star. You're changing the world. You are always taking on new and big things. You're tackling pressing societal issues. You've mapped police violence. You are now working on ourstates.org. Would you tell the listener a little bit about what you're doing and how you are constantly fighting for systems change and social justice?
Yeah, so I got into this work in the aftermath of the Ferguson protests, as protests reverberated across the country, and the national conversation about policing was dominated by this question of whether these police shootings that kept coming out on video, whether it was Tamir Rice or Walter Scott, all of these different police shootings, whether they were isolated incidents or part of a broader systemic problem within policing all across this country that needed a systemic solution. And communities were saying this was systemic. They'd experienced it for a long time, but academics and police leaders and, conservatives would say, where's the data to prove that this is systemic? And they didn't have the data because the federal government doesn't collect comprehensive data on this issue. And so that essentially blocked further progress from being made. It gave an excuse to people, to policymakers, not to implement changes. And so at that point, my background's in policy analysis and data science. And so I connected with activists, protest leaders on the ground in Ferguson, and together we built the most comprehensive database of people killed by police in the United States at mappingpoliceviolence.org. And so we actually built the database to answer those questions. We have data on 99% of the total number of people killed by police in the United States now, going back all the way to 2013 to the present. And we've been using that data to push for change, to give communities and activists the tools they need to show how systemic this issue is in quantitative terms. We're showing the racial disparities. We're looking at particular places, cities, and states and comparing them. And what that allows us to do is really identify solutions in an evidence-based way to say, why is it that, police in some cities are killing people at extraordinary rates higher than the U.S. murder rate, but in other places, police are not killing people at all. What is it about the policies and practices of those departments? What is it about other factors in the environment that contribute to this, and how do we address them? And so what we've been able to do is identify effective policies and then advocate at the local, state, and federal levels for those policies and actually get them changed in places like Baton Rouge and Orlando, Florida. And that work has continued for about 2 years now. And then, of course, the election happened. So as this national conversation about policing has continued, although less so now that Trump is like the only thing that people are talking about, it became clear that there are a lot more people in this work now who are angry, who want to do something, who care about a range of issues, whether it's immigration or reproductive justice or economic justice or police and criminal justice. And people need the tools to be able to effectively influence those issues. And what we found was that oftentimes those issues are controlled at the state level, not actually by the federal government, but predominantly by state governments. And there hadn't been a platform that made it really easy for people to know what was happening, what their state government was considering in terms of legislation, and influence their state representatives to support or oppose particular pieces of legislation and hold those representatives accountable. And so we built our states as a platform to help do just that.
Can just backing up for a second, can you speak in more detail about the way that you gathered the data, so the methodologies that you employ, and then the specific conclusions that you found?
Yeah, so the data comes from predominantly from local media reports. So when police kill somebody, it is a homicide, and according to the best research available, about 99% of the time that is reported in local media. Now, there are gaps. There's 1% that won't be reported, and that's often in very rural places where there's not like any infrastructure or media there. But 99% of the time that's being reported in local media, that can be found online. What we do is we gather that information that has been reported through a system of Google searches and Google alerts, and then cross-reference each of those cases with other databases of information to fill in the gaps. So we look at the person who was killed. We look at their social media profiles, obituaries. We look at criminal records databases. We look at and partner with community organizations that might have particular pieces of information that didn't get reported in the news. And we compile all that and aggregate it into a database, and then visualize the results to help people understand the scale of this issue, where it's happening, and then do analyses to find solutions.
And what has the data shown with regard to the racial disparities that you were talking about earlier?
So, it showed essentially that what protesters within the Black Lives Matter movement have been saying for a long time is absolutely true in quantitative terms. So Black folks are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white folks in this country. They're more likely to be unarmed when killed by police. And what we've also been able to find is that a lot of the justifications that are used in the media, and particularly by conservatives and police, about why Black people are more likely to be killed by police actually don't hold water when you're looking at the facts and the data. They're essentially fake news, right? So what people will say, what conservatives will say about, why is it that Black people are more likely to be killed? They'll say, well, there's a lot of Black on Black crime. There are, Black people, they'll show a lot of crime statistics. and say that, these are dangerous neighborhoods in the inner city and police are encountering violent criminals and they're using force. Basically the Donald Trump narrative. But they never really provide any data to support that. Even the most basic data about, are the places where police are killing people at the highest rates, the places with the highest levels of crime. And so we actually tested that assumption. We looked at the 100 largest cities in America and we compared their crime rates, the rates of violent crime, with the rates of police killings. And there was absolutely no correlation. So, there are places with incredibly high crime rates, like Detroit and Newark, New Jersey, that actually don't have very high rates of police killings. And then there are places with very low crime rates that have very high rates of police killings. So the city that has the highest rate of police killings in the country is actually Orlando, Florida, which is not like the most dangerous city in the world, right? So that's what, now that we have the facts and the data, we're able to be very strategic in, one, countering some of these, the conservative arguments, to get past those and look at solutions. Because if it is not crime rates, then it is something else. And what we found is that it's actually the policies and practices of those police departments that matter. It's whether or not that police department has a policy in place requiring officers to exhaust all other reasonable means of apprehending somebody before they use deadly force, or requiring officers to de-escalate situations when possible. Like those types of things are significantly correlated with reductions in police killings.
There's also, I think when you and I had met for coffee, we discussed Jonathan Smith's suggestions. And for context, Jonathan Smith is the former Special Litigation Section Chief in the DOJ Civil Rights Division, which oversaw investigations into police departments in the aftermath of these incidents. And if anyone were to know what's going on, I mean, other than you, Sam, sorry, I don't want to step on your toes. Jonathan knows a good amount about this from a different perspective, and he is a huge advocate for police union reforms. Is there any traction you're seeing with your work or work of other groups in kind of pushing for and achieving accountability through police unions? Because as some people might know, that is a huge impediment to achieving justice after an unarmed person or innocent person is killed by a police officer.
Yeah, absolutely. So police union contracts are a major issue that oftentimes doesn't get a lot of attention. So we actually worked with Jonathan Smith and a number of others on a project called the Police Union Contract Project, where we got the police union contracts of the 100 largest cities in America, and we combed through each one to find what are the policies embedded in those contracts that make it harder to hold officers accountable for committing misconduct. And what we found was that in almost all of the cities, there were provisions in place that make it harder to hold officers accountable. So things like after a police shooting, an officer gets a week or 5 days before they can even be interviewed about it. Or, an officer's record of misconduct is systematically erased after a few years. So like in Cleveland, it is like 1 year or 2 years, depending on the level of misconduct. Like this is after the officer is actually found to have committed misconduct and been suspended, which is rare enough. Then their record actually gets erased, expunged after only a few years. So you actually can't even know which officers have a record of misconduct in many departments because they've negotiated these contracts with police unions that allow those records to be destroyed. So those are the types of things that are just hiding in plain sight in these contracts that cities are negotiating. And oftentimes, this is not the sort of sexy issue that people are paying attention to, but it matters a lot when you're thinking about accountability. And to answer your question around like what progress has been made, I think the first piece of progress is that this is even becoming an issue, a political issue. So we saw in San Antonio where their contract has a number of these types of provisions. In almost every city, everywhere that we've seen, this has been unanimous, where city councils, once the contract's negotiated, city councils approve these unanimously. They never ask questions about, like, why are these provisions in there that are problematic? They just approve it unanimously. The only thing they fight about is pay. for officers. And for the first time ever in San Antonio, city council members were saying, we actually don't agree with these types of provisions and they should be removed. And we're not going to approve this contract until these get removed. Now, unfortunately, there weren't a majority on the council that had that position. And so it did get approved, right? But it is progress that has actually become an issue in the first place. We're seeing in Chicago now the same thing, where there's a coalition of city council members that have said they're not going to approve this police union contract until those types of provisions are removed. So I think there has been progress. It has not got to the point where it's been decisive in changing those. And I think we need to continue raising this issue until it does.
Do you think that? So I'll start off with an example, and I think it was Baltimore, although I could be wrong. But there was an instance where a police officer reported misconduct of another officer and then received thinly veiled threats as a result of doing that. Does that ring a bell at all?
I don't know which city it was, but yeah, I mean, this happens very often.
So that sort of fraternalism, the protect your own sort of mentality. Do you think that gets nestled within the same sort of problems that arise from the union contracts? Like, do you think that the culture of protecting your own as opposed to seeking out, say, the truth or justice, whatever it may be, do you think that culture gets shaped by the provisions in these contracts that allow for that sort of protectionism to take place?
Oh, absolutely. So it does this in a number of ways. So first, the contracts themselves have provisions that make it hard to actually tell the truth about what's happening. So first of all, the officers get this huge period of time after a shooting or after an incident of misconduct to get to collude with one another and get their story straight before they're actually interrogated about it. There are provisions in there that prevent the names of officers from being released who have been involved in a shooting, for example, that say no names or information about the officers involved shall be released unless the officer is convicted of a crime, which literally never happens. It happens in less than 0.5% of police shootings. So that's part of it. The other part is none of the union contracts actually have provisions that protect officers that are whistleblowers. They always have provisions that protect officers under investigation for misconduct and using excessive force. So the contracts are structured in a way that actually favors the bad officers and discourages the good officers. And I think that's an issue that also needs to be addressed.
A serious consequence of having the Trump administration dominate all the headlines is we don't see the same type of coverage that we had the past few years when there were these police killings. I think it was a fixture of cable news for a while, and it's not receiving the same sort of attention and scrutiny as it was. And I'm certain it's not because this issue has gone away. And if anything, it might be even worse, especially with this societal climate we're dealing with now. Where are we? What is happening, and what can people do to maybe get involved in this issue?
Yeah, so this issue definitely hasn't gone away. In fact, to date this year, over 500 people have been killed by police. More people than have ever been recorded killed by police in at this point of the year. So things are actually getting a little bit worse. They're not getting any media attention because Trump has basically erased this issue from the radar, and that this isn't the only issue that's been erased. I think there are so many different issues that are being erased because of the basic incompetence of this administration and the fundamental issue of democracy being undermined by Russia, taking away health coverage of 24 million people, and I think that's hard because this issue hasn't gone away. Communities are still experiencing it. But now there's no longer the federal government there to be an option to intervene and to help out. There's no longer the media there to reliably draw attention to particular issues. And so people are sort of left without options, particularly in states that are Republican controlled, which is, 32, 33 states. There are no options. I'm thinking about places like Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where, the Alton Sterling case, the DOJ under Sessions decided not to charge the officers for killing Alton Sterling. And now they're sort of stuck because it is a Republican state. It's not like the state attorney general can be trusted, and he's dragging this case on. This is now a year in, and he has given no update on, what they're going to do. The local police chief is just as problematic, and there are no options, right? So people are really without help. And I think for everyday people who want to get involved, it's important to know that this issue still needs attention. It still needs people's involvement. And there are many different ways for people to find a pathway into making a difference. So what we've done is created a structure that helps onboard people into the work. So Stay Woke. If you go to staywoke.org, there's a sign up. And you can pick a particular group to join, and anybody can really join this. You can join the data group, the policy group, elections and campaigns, or design and development. And we add people to Slack groups depending on how they signed up. And we do work, various projects focused on addressing these issues, whether it is figuring out what a police union contract should look like in a particular city, whether it is developing tools that make it easier for people to advocate to their representatives and know what's going on, whether it is collecting and expanding this database beyond police killings to also include all the other types of police violence that exist. All that work is ongoing, and we could always use more help with it. And that's just our organization. There are so many different organizations, local, state, and national organizations that have continued to persist despite this issue being less salient. So reach out to folks who are in your community or in your city and figure out what their needs are and how you can support, because ultimately it'll take all of us to win.
So ourstates.org, I'm on your site now. This thing, it looks awesome. So I can go on the left, I can pick an issue, and it gives me a color-coded map of where the threats or where the progress is in America. So, for instance, I'm looking at the voting rights tab, and it looks like Ohio has legislation up for consideration to protect voting rights, whereas in Georgia, there's legislation to restrict voting rights. Now, what type of, have you seen any type of engagement? How do people get involved through the system? Could you walk us through the process?
Yeah, so the first thing is seeing what's happening in your state. You see that on the website. In terms of engagement, there are different ways that people are getting engaged. So the first is directly contacting the representative. So there's a tool that we built on that site where you put in your zip code or address, and it shows you who your state representatives are, what votes they've taken on these issues, and what their current bills are that they're considering, and then allows you to contact them all in 3 clicks or less. So that is just helpful because what we know is that state representatives almost never get calls. So you think about Congress right now, they're inundated. The switchboards are inundated. I don't know how many calls they've got by this point, but it's got to reach this place where they're marginal returns, and where they're just sort of shutting off. But state representatives have not been getting inundated with calls, despite many of them doing things that are just as harmful as what the Trump administration is doing. And they represent communities that are about 12 times smaller, have 12 times fewer constituents than a member of Congress does. So your voice actually can be really impactful in impacting state policy if you contact your representatives. And so that's one major way that people can make a difference. To engage even more deeply, again, I talked about these Slack groups. We have Slack groups not only by type of work, but also by state. So we have, for every state in America, we have created Slack groups where people are organizing with one another, sharing information and planning together on how to impact state policy in those states. And so I think that's really, really important because, beyond just contacting a representative, we've seen the success of many different organizations, whether it's Indivisible or others, that have created smaller groups and are engaging representatives at town halls and calling them and creating events, hosting events that can embarrass them into taking action. All of that is needed at the state level just as much as it is needed at the congressional level. So those are the different ways that people can get involved, either just looking at the information, calling a representative, or signing up from that site and then joining the Slack groups.
In the course of your work, how prevalent has the inability or hesitance or stubbornness of specifically white people to talk about race in a candid and open way? Has that been a significant impediment along the way? Because I think entrenched in all of this is an honest conversation that needs to be happening more, where we talk about disparities and controlling for race and seeing that there's high correlation in things like police violence, without having to get defensive about it, but instead you're looking at the data, right? What the data tells us, looking at it honestly, and being willing to have conversations that, even if they make us uncomfortable, are important conversations to have. I mean, has that manifested throughout the course of your work? Has it been an obstacle as you've really pushed forward on this question?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been the obstacle, right? The reality is that it doesn't even matter what issue you're talking about. Across every issue, Black folks in this country are getting lower quality services and are getting more of the negative risk factors are encountering those in their lives, right? So when we talk about structural and systemic racism, it's the fact that, for example, even when you have, let's say we have universal health care coverage, the quality of care provided to Black patients is lower by the same doctors as the quality of care provided to white patients, right? Or even if we're talking about thinking about policing, you could have the same policy in place in the police department, but the police are enforcing it differently depending on what you look like, right? If you have marijuana, that enforcement of marijuana is extremely different in the same city, depending on whether you're Black or white. And so, race and racism is so real, and it needs to be directly confronted if we're going to close these gaps. And so, oftentimes, when you try to say that, you can have the best data in the world, but there will always be people who, I think, the knee-jerk reaction is to try to explain this in some way other than race, right? You could also talk about the election, right, with Trump. If there ever was a case that was so obvious that Trump won, in large part because of race and racism and the way in which he was able to use people's racist beliefs and willingness to engage in making racist assumptions about particular groups, whether it's Muslims, immigrants, Black people in inner cities, to win an election, right? To get people's votes at a huge scale. It should be now, but when you look at the media, that conversation isn't even happening anymore. It happened for a day, and then this idea of economic anxiety came out as the dominant thing. That got more play than the racism, which didn't make sense. Then of course studies came out showing that actually this was racism. We've proven it. We have the data. Racism and sexism are the most significant predictors of why people voted for Trump, not economic anxiety. And then, of course, The Atlantic comes out with an article creating something new called cultural anxiety. They literally created a new concept just so racism wouldn't be the conversation. And so, that is so problematic and so challenging. It's how do we actually have this conversation? And beyond having the conversation, think very intentionally about what the implications of that are. So when we think about policy, if we're actually thinking about race and racism, it causes us to make hard decisions. So, for example, when we think about juries, we know when you look at the data that having one Black juror, just one or more, but even just one, almost equalizes the probability that somebody accused of the same crime and convicted of the same crime will get the same sentence. But there is no rule requiring that there should be at least one Black juror, right, when it's a Black defendant. Why is that? So I think when we're really serious about this, it's about looking at the data and being like, how do we actually close these gaps? And do our policies achieve that goal in real time? And for almost everything that's been proposed in our political discussion, the answer to that is no. And then we wonder why black people aren't turning out to vote for these types of policies. And I think that is going to be a problem, right? We have to figure out, like, what does it look like to end racism and racial inequality, at least structurally? And what kind of policies get us there? What does the agenda look like that gets us there? And I think if we can figure that out, we can turn out a lot more black folks, get more people who've been disaffected engaged in the process, because people will see that this is actually about them. It is about their lives. And it is not about sort of taking advantage of voters around election time, but not passing policies that close those gaps.
And at bottom, I mean, the frustration that I've observed. So, like, we'll just take the Trump election as an example. I've seen conversations happen where it's not even a question of like a willingness to admit that racial animus was the most influential driver of decision making of some voters, but a lack of a willingness to even entertain the possibility that it motivated to any degree some voters. I mean, where to have an honest conversation, I mean, we have to be like willing to look at, I think it was the Washington Post that published at least one of the studies that you mentioned with regard to like correlations of different variables in voting outcomes. And I just have a hard time understanding, as a person who, likes empirical evidence, that something like that emerges and we're not even willing to have a discussion about the possibility that this played a role. I mean, we're not even willing to go that far, let alone to the extent that like we can entertain the possibility that this was the major driver behind a lot of people's decision making. But you have to, in order to, really robustly reach the sort of results that you're talking about, I'm of the opinion that you have to have open and honest and willing conversation. And it is very, very frustrating to see this sort of intransigent refusal to even begin the conversation.
Right.
And I know, I'm obviously, we're having a conversation with, I think, two people who are largely in agreement. But for the listeners, at least, I always emphasize the importance of dialogue and like, just be willing to entertain, without immediately getting into a defensive crouch and digging your heels in. Be willing to entertain that these biases drove some people to make that decision, because the empirical data certainly doesn't suggest the opposite. I mean, all the data that I've seen, as you've already mentioned, suggests that there's a strong correlation between that sort of animus and decisions at the ballot box.
Absolutely. I think there was a study that came out recently, it was reported by Vox, which showed that if you asked, it was, they controlled it where half the participants they were asked a question about healthcare and I think immigration and a few other major issues. And before they got that question, they were primed with language that said, by 2042, the U.S. will be a majority minority country. And then they asked the question about, like, do you support universal health care, or do you support, comprehensive immigration reform? And by just talking about race, again, like, it's not like we don't talk about race. We talk about race all the time. Like, Donald Trump talks about race every time he opens his mouth. The problem is, like, it is talked about in a way that is just, we're going to say, there are a lot of immigrants coming. There are, the U.S. is becoming very diverse. That's what he says. And then he goes on and starts talking about, this is why we need to build a wall, right? So in the study, it was like, okay, there are a lot of immigrants. U.S. is going to be majority minority by 2042. How do you feel about, comprehensive immigration reform? How do you feel about healthcare reform? And on every one of those questions for white voters, it was a sea change in different support. So it literally flipped their support dramatically. Like, it went from like 70% support to like 30-something% support. So, like, we think, as a country that, like, politics, it's about partisanship, it's about, like, what your beliefs are, what your economic interests are about particular issues. But, like, what this showed is that, like, it is all about race. right? Like you can just say some prime people with some keywords about race in the beginning and completely flip their entire political view, their entire agenda. And so I think race is so powerful. Race is being talked about all the time, but it's being talked about in ways that are very intentional in getting white people to support the conservative agenda, right? So it is like this identity politics that's happening, but it sort of happens below the radar in a way that doesn't get called out as explicitly identity politics.
So, what's your take on the argument that I've heard that because you use the phrase identity politics and people flinch at that a lot of the time. What's your take on the argument that some people make that, well, if we really dive in and become really infatuated with this sort of identity politicking, that what we end up doing then is turning different races into monoliths, and that in a way almost undermines, say, like the basic agency or humanity of any given individual in that group. So like, for instance, if we're focusing nearly exclusively on our race, right, when we make political decisions, and like that's the claim, some critics of identity politics make the argument that, well, okay, by doing that, you're then boiling a person down solely to the color of their skin, and that is what purportedly those same people are trying to fight against. Like, what would your response be to that argument? Because I've heard it quite a bit, and I'm interested in hearing what you would have to say to something like that.
So I would say politics is about addressing social issues, right? How do we as a society come together to put in place policies that distribute resources slightly differently and power slightly differently so that it can improve people's lives and address real issues that exist? The issues with race exist. They're real. Like, they exist in very material terms, right? Like, the average white family has $131,000 in more resources than the average black family. Like, that's real. I don't care like how you want to talk about it. Like, that's not going to make those numbers change. So our politics should be willing to engage those disparities and address them. And if it's not going to, then those disparities will continue to exist. Like, there's no reason to think that that's going to change if we never have a conversation about it, if we don't talk about that huge divide by race, or if we try to say that we can address this purely through universalist policies, right? So like the Bernie Sanders type approach, where if we just raise the minimum wage to $15, somehow we're going to wipe out this gap. That actually doesn't do anything to wipe out that gap, because like, even if we both made the same amount, like let's say we both made $60,000, you would still have $131,000 more than I do. That gap wouldn't grow, right? But we would continue to make the same amount on top of that, and that gap would never close. And like, that's a huge amount. That's like buying a house, that's going to college, that's like a medical emergency. Like, all of that is what that gap means to families. And so, we have to address that. That is so real. You cannot address that purely through universalist policies. And so we have to be real about people's lives, about people's needs. And if people's needs require us to have an approach that is honest and explicit about race, then that's what we need to have.
Okay, and I want to make sure I'm not putting words in your mouth. I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So essentially, would you say that like that sort of argument, that creating monoliths that subsequently undermines individuality, is like a distortion of the issue, or ignoring the issue, or a red herring, essentially, from the actual like debate that we should be having, or discussion? A discussion, I think, is a better word, but is that fair?
I mean, I would say we're not creating monoliths. Like, monoliths exist. Race exists, right? Like, if you are perceived as black in America, like you're grouped as a black person in America and treated as a black person in America, regardless of how you as an individual are, right? Like, I can't change being a black person just because like I decided to have a different mood or approach to life.
Gotcha.
So like, we're not creating monoliths. Monoliths exist in terms of our identities and how we're perceived by others. And we need to address what those perceptions mean to people's lives and how to make sure that they don't result in negative outcomes.
How do we then go about reducing this stubbornness that we've talked about before, and this unwillingness to have the conversation? How do we go about minimizing that as an obstacle, or getting to the heart of that problem, and like opening up these conversations to the extent or to the end of affecting the political change that would redress the issues that we're talking about? And I know that's like a very broad question, so feel free to take as much time or,
Yeah, so
uh,
I think there are a number of strategies, and they depend on, like, everybody has a different skill set, has a different background, and can bring something new to the table in terms of approaching these issues. So for me, like, my background's in data. So data is how I address this. I think if we are addressing this in quantitative terms, we can say this is the gap, right? This is the $131,000, or this is the number of 3 times more likely to be killed by police, and we can say, okay, now what are the evidence-based practices that can impact those numbers based on the data that is available, and that's a different conversation, right? That's a different conversation than people wanting to bring up one individual case and debate a case. It's about what are we doing about this issue overall, and what do the numbers say, and can we mathematically get to a point where we can have confidence that this will address a goal that we believe in, right? If we believe that people shouldn't be getting killed by police, and that is our goal, then we can look at the data and say, okay, in order to get to that goal, we need to address racism in policing and racial bias, because it is a huge contributing factor to why so many people, particularly black people, are being killed by police. So I think that's one strategy that I've used. I think there are many other strategies. So there's also a strategy of continuing to tell the truth in ways that make so apparent, like, how these inequities look every day, right? So an example of that, I was recently in Baton Rouge, doing some advocacy there around state legislation, around policing. And so I was in the state capitol building where the state legislature is. And while I'm there, I noticed that all of the people who were, like, cleaning the floors and serving the food and printing out the papers were young black men in jumpsuits who were prisoners, working essentially for free. And it looked straight up, it was with an overseer there, a white guy with a gun, like, mean mugging them, like, looking on, like, making sure they didn't do anything wrong or whatever. And it was just, you go to Louisiana, and I guess they have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Two or three of those people who are incarcerated are black. But it like, the way that appears really makes clear that something unjust is happening here. It looks like slavery, right? It is a modern slavery. And I think just, like, taking those pictures, like, telling that story, like, the story got like 35,000 retweets, in part because it, like, told the truth about what was happening in a particular place. It made it visceral and real what was happening in a way that people, like, couldn't they couldn't really turn away and, like, excuse that. And I think we've seen the success of that with people with cell phones taking pictures and video of these police shootings, just making clear, like these injustices are real, and here's, like, the audio visual evidence that shows that in a way that people can't ignore. So I think that's another strategy, right? So one, having the numbers and the data. I think two, having the visceral sort of emotional appeal of core injustice. And I think, the third part is, like, we saw in Portland, right, where, 2 white men were killed intervening. Some white supremacist was attacking Muslim women. And so, that's another strategy, is that, like, bystanders, right, people in your everyday life, they might be, like, family members who are Trump supporters, and like, go about their life without ever being checked for it, without ever being confronted about it. And, like, that's no longer acceptable. And we saw in Portland the incredible courage of people who said, this is not acceptable. I'm going to actually put my life on the line to stop this kind of abuse. And I think we need more of that as well.
So it seems that, based on your conversation or your comments on Baton Rouge, and thinking about this recent push for Blue Lives Matter bills, seems to be at the intersect of both of your efforts with mapping police violence and our states. So what's happening there? Could you tell the listeners what are these Blue Lives Matter bills or laws, if they have been passed, and how do they pose a risk to these communities?
Yeah, so Blue Lives Matter bills, Louisiana was the first to sign it into law in 2016. already just this year, right, in the first 6 months of this year, 13 states have signed them into law. And they're incredibly dangerous because what they do is they increase the criminal penalties on people who are protesters and people who police essentially want to put in jail. So, for example, in places, even in North Dakota, where you had Standing Rock, they passed a law that said you can't block roadway. If you block a roadway, then you can be arrested and given double the normal criminal penalty. So they've doubled the penalty for people who are blocking roadways, people who are protesting, right? Like all the protests that we've seen. That's a major strategy for raising awareness, making it unavoidable that there is injustice, that that there's a problem. And so now that means that people who are doing that, there's twice the risk involved with doing it. It discourages the expression of free speech, the right to assemble, and it increases incarceration. And the other piece is that they're also increasing penalties on, so what they say is, we are increasing penalties on people who attack law enforcement officers, right? And of course, like if that's your frame, like you have a pretty easy time passing this, particularly through Republican legislatures, because everybody wants to say they're, standing up for law enforcement officers. But the reality is when you look at the language of these bills, oftentimes it means that people who are charged with resisting arrest are actually now getting felony charges, getting really serious charges and fines and prison time. When resisting arrest, an officer literally can say that you are resisting arrest. Like if you open your mouth while you're being arrested, if you say anything while you're being arrested, if you ask them why you're being arrested, if you're filming them while they're, all of these basic things that protests are doing, that people who are doing nothing wrong and just want to, and there's a real injustice. They're being targeted and they're like, why are you targeting me? Now people like that are actually getting stiffer prison sentences, larger fines, and more disincentives for actually standing up for the truth. And I think that's really, really dangerous. And it's a trend now where we're seeing 13 states sign it into law, and probably more will do so unless there's an active effort at the state level to resist it.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just the refrain that, I have friends that are police officers or people in my family are police officers, and, they have a really hard job and they're good people. I mean, these concepts are not mutually exclusive, and that's one of the biggest stressors one of the biggest things I would like to stress or emphasize, to people who are so hesitant to engage in this sort of dialogue is that, you're not admitting defeat by looking empirical data in the face and saying, okay, this is a problem. How do we go about fixing it? It's not an indictment of your friends and family. It doesn't force you to, adopt this view that, you're opposing some enemy across the board. It's just, we can be honest about it and say these problems exist. There's an animus. There are inequalities, and it's incumbent on us then to be willing to have this conversation and address them, as opposed to, again, adopting this defensive posture. But I think, as you're pointing out, there are evidence-based solutions, that can work, that they've been tested, and that the approach that you're taking, which is to show through data, to illustrate these problems. I don't know. I'm appreciative of the work, absolutely. I mean, I think what you're doing is super important and awesome and exciting, and it's just bringing more to the forefront a conversation that needs to happen. But understanding in the meantime that having this conversation doesn't put you in the position that I think a lot of people who are hesitant to have it want to say that it does. That's really important, to take that first step and be willing to accept the responsibility that we need to as a society begin to implement changes and solutions to the issues that we've been talking about for the past hour or so.
I see you as a leader in this area, and you're someone I look up to and I admire your work. So definitely thank you for taking the initiative, tackling these issues, because I think so often people feel this way, but people don't really. I don't know. They don't take the effort or exercise the effort to actually put in the hard work and fight for systems change. But you are, and I think more people should get engaged. Go to ourstates.org. definitely use that as a vital resource, and follow Sam on Twitter. He's always making really great points, and I've taken a lot away from your posts. He's at Sam SWEY, SAMSWEY.
Thank you so much for the time, Sam.
Thank you so much.
If you like what you've heard today and want to support the podcast, follow us on Twitter at ThinkTwicePod and like us on Facebook at ThinkTwice.
And check out our website, thinktwicepodcast.com. And we could absolutely use your support. Please visit patreon.com/thinktwice to view subscription options. For as little as $5 a month, you can support our work. $5. That's 1 cup of coffee a month. Thank you.